We heard that extremely tragic news that there were those 6 hostages who had been killed. Hersh Goldberg Polin, who's 23, Eden Yerushalmi, who was 24, Ori Denino, who was 25, Almog Sarusi, 27, Alex Lubnov, 33, and Carmel Gat, who was 40. And these people were household names in Israel, along with many of the other hostages who were seized on October the 7th, kidnapped, and kept in brutal conditions, tortured. I mean, we've seen a proof of life video from Hersh, where you could see that he'd had an arm blown off. He had a stump left, operated on by who knows who in his captivity. And then they were, according to the reports from Israel, shot in the head and elsewhere in the body only days ago. And all of that while the hostage negotiations were still going on. I thought it's particularly interesting because when Ismail Haniyeh was killed, he was killed in that targeted strike in Iran. Everybody said that Israel had done it, but they haven't claimed responsibility for it. There were people screeching, condemning everything they'd done, saying that it had derailed the negotiations, that this was going to put an end to the negotiations.
But when Hamas have actually killed 6 of the hostages who were being negotiated over, you're seeing very little reporting about that being a problem for the negotiations. In fact, on the contrary,
it's clear there are no negotiations because Qatar and Egypt are not honest brokers.
Well, they're not honest brokers at all. And I think it's about time that rather than putting all this pressure on Israel, that people like David Lammy and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are doing, there ought to be a lot more pressure on Hamas. There ought to be a lot more pressure on Qatar. There ought to be a lot more pressure on the bad actors in this, who've been allowed to get away for too long with behaving like they're civilized countries, civilized players who had any interest in a deal which would see these hostages released. The release of these hostages is a humanitarian issue. It's not political. There is literally no discussion about whether or not they should be released. These are people who are seized from their beds, from their homes. These are peace-loving people. These are ordinary citizens who were kidnapped and taken hostage brutally by Hamas and being kept by Hamas and other Palestinians in Gaza in their homes. We've heard from some of the hostages who were released. And let's not forget that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has achieved the release or rescue of, I think, over half of the hostages that were seized by the terrorists, the Palestinian terrorists who stormed the border. We've heard that they were kept in homes of ordinary citizens.
Including journalists of Al Jazeera.
A journalist who was credited on the Al Jazeera website, a teacher, an UNRWA teacher, a UN
UNRWA teacher. Let's not forget UNRWA.
And I think we need to remember that Hamas murdered these abductees, these 6, in cold blood. They have not responded positively to any of the negotiations for a deal since November.
They didn't even turn up to the last one.
So, I mean, all of this pressure and criticism of Netanyahu is fine, and it's one thing. You can criticise any politician for how they are conducting themselves in a very complex situation like this. But Hamas has never accepted any of the deals that have been put forward. So the idea that somehow Netanyahu is personally responsible, and even these protests that are going on in Israel are, of course, very understandable, that the population are desperate for the release of the hostages. There's also a lot of hard feeling against Netanyahu. He was the Prime Minister in charge on October the 7th. That is an extremely heavy responsibility that he holds. But I do think that some of this pressure shouldn't really be all on his shoulders. It should be towards Hamas, towards Egypt, towards Qatar, towards the United States, towards Western countries, which should be putting more pressure where it's due. The people who need pressuring to release the hostages are those who have direct influence on Hamas. The people and the countries and the players who could actually make this happen, and what should happen, to be precise, is that all of the hostages should be released immediately, unconditionally. Israel should not have to make concessions to get the release of ordinary citizens who were seized from their homes, from their beds, who have had relatives killed, who've had limbs blown off by these terrorists that started this war. That is plain and simple. Then there can be discussions about what happens next. And I would say that that's probably been the biggest problem with all of these so-called negotiations. It's that actually they've taken the wrong framework. The framework needs to be, you release everyone immediately, and then we can talk.
Yes, I think that's very straightforward and so obvious, and anyone who prevaricates away from that single policy is encouraging not just this war to continue, but future wars as well.
And actually, one quick last bit, which is just to say that the idea that what they've been negotiating over, and some of the sticking points, has been to do with whether the Israeli army should evacuate Gaza totally, specifically along what they call the Philadelphia corridor. That's the border between Gaza and Egypt. The reason that's such a key strategic position, and Netanyahu is very reluctant to remove troops from there, is because for years, for well over a decade, weapons, cars, money, contraband, and people have passed freely over that or under that border in the tunnels. Training in Iran, Iranian military training has taken place. Masses of industrialized military weapons have been funneled into Gaza, and that's exactly why this war looks like it does, because for too long that border was completely porous. And so now that Israel has seized that border and has got control over it, Hamas is really feeling the pain because they can't rearm, they can't retrain. And if Israel were to evacuate that area and completely withdraw from it, allowing them once again to cross under that border, and potentially the terror chiefs and the hostages could even pass under that border and disappear forever.
Including the poor child Kafir Bibas, who we don't even know whether that poor child is alive or dead, and in fact he has lived a longer life in incarceration than he has in freedom. Poor child. Who
kidnaps a baby? Who kidnaps a baby and holds them in terrorist custody, underground, or in unbearable conditions? It's just inhuman, and I think that people need to remember that that is what is at the heart of this war.
Let's just pay tribute to the 6 hostages who were murdered. The heroism of these 6 people is beyond belief. This is the words of Brendan O'Neill. Hersh Goldberg Polin picked up Hamas's hand grenades and threw them away in an effort to protect his friends. As a result, he lost that arm. Alexander Lobanov helped to evacuate people from the Nova Music Festival before running with 5 others into the Be'eri forest, where Hamas captured him. Almog Sarusi stayed by the side of his severely injured girlfriend, leading to his capture. He died for love. Ori Danino made it out of the slaughter zone of the Nova Festival, but then actually went back to help others. Carmel Gat was called a guardian angel by freed hostages because what she did, she taught them meditation to help them endure the captivity. And Eden Yerushalmi, she's just 24. She phoned police on the 7th of October and calmly gave details about what was happening at the Nova Festival. Her last words to them were, "Will you find me? Okay." Okay.
And Johnny, I don't know if I got a second just to say another few words, if you don't mind. But to me, let's broaden out. Let's look at this. This war is not about some poor little enclave and massive Israel. This war is about Iran, which is pulling the strings of terror proxies in the entire region. And even if we focus in on the Palestinians, any discussion of the idea of giving them a state at this point as a reward for what they did on October the 7th is utterly unthinkable to anyone with any sense. I would go further and say, what have the Palestinians ever done in the history of the world that we remember favourably? Can anyone remember a positive contribution from the Palestinian people? I think what they're most famous for is popularising suicide bombings. They didn't even invent that, but they claimed that off someone else and they made it their own. These people have united around a cause which is entirely focused on the destruction of Israel, the one Jewish state in the world, a state which accepts people from all around the world, which has really proved to be an amazing success in many ways, has its faults and its shortcomings like any state, especially democracies as it is, shares a lot of values with us. But the Palestinian people, time and time again, have shown that their interest is not in having a state alongside Israel. They've been offered a state so many times, and in fact, the closer those offers have been to their dream of what they specifically want, the more violent their rejection, the more violent their attacks on Israel, on Jews around the world, not just in Israel. They used to conduct hijackings and terror attacks on people outside Israel as well. I don't think there is any case to be made at this point, at any rate, for us to be discussing immediate ceasefires and states for people who have carried out attacks like the one on October the 7th. Instead, we should be talking about absolute victory against the barbarism that took place then.
If the international community wants to create an environment where terror is rewarded, then they need their heads checked. Then what is the point of civil society? What is the point of the international community